ministers, their families, everyone. Great Spirit, we come to you today as a few of your many children. We thank you for all the blessings you have given us, and thank you for the gift of life, and help us make the best of that life. Thank you. Through her we get our foods and medicines that we consume every day. Ahaan tawinan, minapiyag pilipiwista o kawasunsak. Giwati mo na ang mitsito, mga gihniya kustausyo. Giap sumota kami ko, kaya sopse. Igagawis ka rin ako daw, ang gito. Muayang nitimak ko, ipimasawi ka mga kanina. Ikotatok na mga kustausyo, ang lego kapit. May kanawag daw, kaya sopse. Mamsi na mo ap sa suskay, ni so ka mo sa uwi, uyawatak sa mga gustokes, ay itaw sa gawas na magu, nagwahote, pagdags na mga gusto. Bilang mismo at tamahan nagagsiwat sa uwi tamaw na agakyo, uligani wag, mino ko yawan sa hamna na uligani wag, gusto ang ginawasungit ko. Diba, pag-expert ko yan. Yung sanis mo ka, ang magitaw na naman. Tawag niya tibis suga kayo Tawag isuwi takso. Hay.
Thank you for the opening prayer, Mike. I'll just introduce myself again. My name is Tanya Capo, and I'm from Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation. I'll be assisting this evening with moderating, timekeeping, keeping you all on task. I'll be assisted by a couple of our young people. We have Jessica Hall from Duncan's First Nation and Kieran Auger from Blue River Cree Nation. So the format of this evening is going to be each of the candidates will have 5 minutes, 10 minutes actually, to introduce yourself and your party. And then once each of you have done that, we're going to move right into a question and answer period. So I've calculated 2 minutes each that you have to answer the questions that are posed to you. The questions came together today. The elders, the Treaty 8 elders were meeting and having conversations. So a lot of the questions come from them that will be put to you today, and you'll have 2 minutes each to answer. Give probably 2 minutes at the end. I think we'll have enough time for maybe 9 questions, hopefully 10, but just 2 minutes for concluding comments once the question part is over. So without further ado, I would like to ask you to introduce your party and yourself, and we're going to go by alphabetical order. So I'd like to call upon Alberta Liberal Party, David Kahn.
Thank you very much, Ms. Capo, and thank you to Chief Arthur Notsky and the Treaty 8 First Nations organization and chiefs. Thank you very much for having me here. Tansei Edlanete. I am very honored to be here today to participate in your Treaty 8 forum. I look out on the crowd and the audience today, and I know there must be some familiar faces out there. I was in your communities just this past spring and all around Alberta, including Valley View, High Level, Fort Vermilion. I was helping to distribute the proceeds of an historic $170 million settlement to you, your friends and neighbors. That $170 million settlement of the Treaty 8 agricultural benefits claims was a settlement on behalf of two of our clients, Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation and Tall Cree First Nation. And I was your lawyer. Our firm was the lead firm battling for and achieving the settlement of First Nations agricultural benefits claims for 18 First Nations across Treaty 8 territory. I personally traveled to Ottawa on a number of occasions over a number of years to help negotiate the settlement. And your ancestors signed this treaty in good faith 120 years ago now almost, and signed it in good faith with the federal government. The people of Treaty 8 are honorable people and stood by this treaty, but the federal government did not honor many of the commitments. And that's why I had to travel to Ottawa to battle the federal government's lawyers and INAC bureaucrats on your behalf. I've also been involved in drafting, filing, and fighting for fair financing for reserve schools and for treaty land entitlements. I'm still an Indigenous rights lawyer, but now I am leader of the Alberta Liberal Party. As leader, along with Liberal MLAs that will be elected in the next election, I will continue to fight for your rights in the Alberta legislature. And I'll use my knowledge and experience gained over the last 8 years of being an Indigenous rights lawyer on your behalf. And I'll do that with full knowledge of your issues and your concerns, because they've been my issues and concerns over the last 8 years as I've battled to represent you. And I didn't mind flying to Ottawa or driving here to Edmonton to the courthouse in pursuit of justice for your rights, but I much preferred the natural beauty of Sturgeon Lake or the Great Peace River Valley near Tall Cree First Nation. And frankly, the food was better. And I hope to come and visit all of you in your communities in the future and see all of you again soon as Alberta Liberal Party leader and an elected MLA in the Alberta legislature. So I really, again, thank you very much for having me here to participate and answer your questions and concerns. And thank you very much. Masi Choke.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. If I can get you to turn off your microphone. I also want to let you know, in case you didn't know already, that we're live streaming. So anyone who's not able to attend today is watching online through the magic of the internet. So without further ado, we'll go to our next candidate, which is Mr. Stephen Mandel, and we're going alphabetically by party name.
Thank you. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here. I want to thank you very much for allowing us to participate. We are in traditional Treaty 6 territory, even though how important Treaty 8 is. I'd like to acknowledge that. The Alberta Party is not as well known as some of the other parties, but we're the up-and-comers. We're a party that is, we call fiscally responsible and socially progressive. We care deeply about people, about building a community, about building identities for all of us, and we think the Alberta Party has a lot to offer. We see that the relationship with the First Nations is vitally important to the future of the province of Alberta. And is this my 10 minutes, or is this my just introduction to see who I am?
It's both. It's your 10 minutes of introducing yourself and your party.
Okay, great. Okay. So the Alberta Party is a party that is a grassroots party. We work very hard to make sure that that our ideas come up from our people up through the party, and allows us to build a platform that is creative and dynamic. We have previously put out a policy on Alberta position of First Nations rights. That's on our website, and we have some copies here today for you, if you so desire. We see that the relationship between the provincial government and the First Nations need to be different. If we're going to begin to change that relationship, one of the most important things is resource sharing, resource revenue sharing. We need to come up with a formula that allows us to work with you so that you can build your communities in a way that's effective and creative. The government historically has, I think, as well as the businesses, have forgotten how important that is. And I think that that's one of the first things we do. We'd sit down with the chiefs to find a way in which we can come up with a formula that would be effective for each one of you so that you can build the kind of community you would like to see, not one that we would like to see. It's your community, it's your nation, so we believe that's vitally important. Harvesting is another issue we know is very important. I find it difficult to understand why under treaty rights you have those rights to harvest on Crown lands, and so as a government we would respect that. We think that's vitally important. Obviously, we don't think that someone should go and do commercial fishing or commercial hunting, but my belief is that people from the First Nations go within the wilderness of Alberta and enjoy the fruits of the areas in which they live and should have the rights to enter Crown lands to harvest the kind of things that they have traditionally, whether it's fish or hunting. So we would respect that. We also see that it's important for First Nations to control kids in care. Kids in care is something over the years, I think I've heard people say that the relationship between the government and oftentimes kids in care is not much different than the residential schools. And it's the inability of the government to understand the traditions, the history, and the language of the First Nations people makes such a difference. And so we would like to see that relationship to be strengthened. We'd like to see that those responsibilities for taking care of children and care both in the urban and the rural environment as well as across the province be returned to the community so they could have those abilities to do the kind of things that they believe are important with their children. Their children to stay with families wherever possible. We think that's a vitally important part about how to build a much better First Nations community, a much better society. People talked a great deal about pipelines and how they can be a great asset. In Alberta, we talk about a pipeline. We need pipelines. We need the ability to move our products across our province and across North America and off to Tidewater. And we need to do that in partnership with First Nations and creating ownership opportunities, but also allowing, I think, the environmental control, making sure that the discussion comes so that we watch to make sure we're protecting the land. The land is vitally important to all of us, and if we don't do the kinds of things that are respectful to the land, we're not going to have any land left in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from today, or 100 years from today. So we really believe putting that oversight, not just negotiations, but in the discussion and in the overall control of that after everything is done within the First Nations communities and the lands that they control. I believe personally that you would have a heck of a lot better job on overseeing the land than I think we would, because you're so much more passionate about it. It is how you live, it's where you live, and how you've made your lives what they are today. We also see it important in education. We think that one of the most important things about the Alberta Party, we deeply believe in education and post-secondary education. We think there's an incredible opportunity to create a Treaty 8 college associated maybe out of Slave Lake, but to create the opportunity so your children don't have to go into the city of Edmonton or into Calgary or other places to get a post-secondary education. They can stay at home, they can find ways in order to build that education profile, stay within their communities and build a much better life for themselves. So we see post-secondary education as a very important opportunity, both within your communities and the surrounding areas, to create that opportunity. So working with communities to build some form of university post-secondary education up in maybe the Slave Lake area would be an option, but we look forward to working with you to do that. There's a multitude of other things we would like to do as a party. We deeply believe in the partnership between ourselves and you. We believe it's an equal partnership, one that we can work on to build. We want to be your partners. We want to create a much better society for you. And as you are able to build your communities with the resource revenue you're going to receive from partnership, you can build the much needed housing. You can build the much needed infrastructure. So that partnership, we hope, will create the kind of opportunity that you much deserve that has been lost for so many years. So at the Alberta Party, we're pleased to be here today. We look forward to answering any questions. And we thank you for allowing us to be here. And thank you for the glass of water. The food divine. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mandel. If I can call upon Mr. Richard Fian.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Appreciate it. I'd like to say thank you, of course, to Grand Chief Arthur Noski and all the chiefs of Treaty 8 And thank our elder Mike Beaver for the prayer, and of course all the elders that are here to ask questions and participate in this very important conversation. Very happy to be here this evening with Danielle Larrabee, who currently, of course, is the Minister of Children's Services and will be our candidate again in Slave Lake. So we'll both be around to answer lots of questions later on if anybody wants to address us personally. It's really great to be here with so many people from Treaty 8 here on Treaty 6 territory. It's a good intermingling. Today I really want to talk to you about an important choice that you're going to make later on this year. And I think it's a choice to choose Rachel Notley, who's been a fighter on your behalf on issues that matter to you, or to choose an opposition that has largely forgotten you and your concerns. Rachel was born and raised in Treaty 8, and she knows what it's like to grow up in rural Alberta and the challenges that this brings. After 44 years in power, the former government was corrupt, entitled, and untouched. They built sky palaces for themselves, handed out huge pay raises and golf memberships to their friends, and partied on the taxpayer dime. When times were good, they saved nothing and shared almost nothing with Indigenous people. When times were bad, they bulldozed hospitals, neglected roads and transit, and slashed funding to Indigenous communities like the Consultation Capacity Fund. In 2015, Indigenous people said enough. They elected Rachel Notley in order to start building a new relationship between Indigenous people and government and to fight on their behalf. Just months before Rachel became Premier, however, Alberta headed into the worst recession in generations. The oil price collapse hit the economy hard, government revenues collapsed, and tens of thousands of Albertans lost their jobs. For Indigenous communities already struggling, that was particularly hard. Fighting the recession and protecting Alberta's families was Rachel's first priority. Instead of making a bad situation worse, she protected funding for healthcare and education. Our kids and loved ones should not have to pay the price for a cyclical world market. Instead of laying off doctors and nurses and slashing the programs that provide benefits to Indigenous communities, she built new schools and hospitals and created new programs for Indigenous communities worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She helped Alberta's lowest paid workers by raising the minimum wage. She helped families stretch their paycheck by introducing a new child tax benefit, and ensured that people living on reserve were eligible for the carbon levy rebates. She capped electricity prices, froze tuition fees, and invested in bringing clean water to reserves like the Deneta at Bushy. She fought for a more diverse economy and gave full value for Alberta's resources. At the same time, Rachel put a stop to the insider deals and special perks for friends that had become all too common in the final years of the former government. Rachel was dealt a tough hand with low oil prices, and yet she's done a very good job in providing a stable government and protecting the services for all people. She's protected funding for schools and hospitals, invested in people and jobs, and made important progress protecting the environment. She's cleaned up government, no more corruption and insider deals. She's made investments that count in areas like clean water, education, and economic development for Indigenous communities. She's taken important steps to ensure that Alberta takes responsibility for its role in residential schools and in the 60s scoop. She understands that for years, First Nations communities have been left behind, hurt by our history of colonialism, which is why she believes it's important that Indigenous communities not only benefit from our energy future, but they are equity owners of it. There's more work to be done. But today in Alberta, things are looking up. Our economy is growing with 90,000 new jobs created last year. First Nations communities all over Alberta are benefiting from groundbreaking climate leadership projects, including equity participation in commercial scale energy projects. In fact, the Indigenous round of the Renewable Energy Program saw 3 First Nations, including Sawridge from Treaty 8, to be successful in partnerships to build over 300 megawatts of energy. Not only that, the Indigenous round came in cheaper than round 3, proving those naysayers wrong who suggested that it's more expensive to do business in Indigenous communities. New and innovative agreements between Indigenous communities, industry, and government are resulting in protection for vast amounts of land and incorporation of Indigenous wisdom and knowledge into land management. Alberta was the first province in Canada to sign on to the Jordan's Principle, making children a priority instead of being overlooked. Alberta is training every public servant to better understand Indigenous history, training, and experiences. For the first time, Alberta's entire kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum will include teaching that better reflects Indigenous peoples' histories and worldviews. For the first time, returning officers must ask nations if they wish to have a voting station on reserves. Under Rachel Notley, 3 Indigenous women judges have been appointed to the bench, and an Indigenous woman has been appointed to the health board. Treaty rights and land claims have been taken seriously. We signed a historic agreement with the Treaty 8 Trappers Association to preserve and protect trap lines for future generations. And after 117 years, we finally signed the Rubicon land claim. We have a leader who will fight for what matters. But we also know where Jason Kenney stands. During the by-election in Fort McMurray, he referred to First Nations as special interest groups. He believes that Crown land is not treaty land and doesn't have a credible plan for protecting the environment. He's already promising to sell out at least 100,000 acres of Crown land without consulting Indigenous communities, and that is essential to the Beaver First Nations treaty land entitlement negotiations. Jason Kenney has promised to destroy everything that the NDP government has done. He has said that this summer will be the summer of repeal. Have no doubt that he will undo all of the hard work that we have done together. So you need to ask yourself, will Jason Kenney roll back funding for water to reserves? Will he roll back protections for the environment? Will he roll back the carbon levy, which has provided over $85 million in funding directly to Indigenous communities in the last 2 years alone? Roll back training for all Alberta Public Service employees on Indigenous history, culture, and worldview? Shred the new curriculum that better reflects Indigenous peoples and their experiences in residential schools in the 60s scoop? Shred cooperative management agreements on the protected areas, eliminate the Indigenous Wisdom Advisory Panel that provides advice to Alberta's chief scientists. Will he turn back time on protected provincial parks? Will he renege on Alberta's agreement with the federal government on Jordan's principle? Will he cancel Alberta's drive to renew energy with its promise of equity participation for Indigenous communities? What about Alberta's commitment to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which underpins all of these initiatives that we put forward? He has promised a $700 million tax cut to the super wealthy and nothing for anyone else. And instead of investing, he'll make cuts and privatize healthcare and education. And as his MLA, Mr. Hanson, who's here with us tonight, has said those cuts are going to hurt. During the last legislative session, I want to point out that the UCP's emulations in the last session, obviously nothing was important enough to bring that to the legislature. During the last, under his leadership, the UCP is determined to turn back the clock on human rights to the 1950s. Not a particularly good time for Indigenous people. Thank you. Many of you here this evening and listening online know I've been very concerned about the relationship between us. You know that I have come to your communities, driven your gravel roads, and visited your schools and health centers. I've tried in my best way to keep my mouth shut and my ears open. I've spent many hours with elders in pipe ceremonies and at culture camps, seeking wisdom through traditional teachings. I do this because it matters. It matters to me, and it matters to you. And I know that we have accomplished together much in only 3 short years, but that can all be taken away with the stroke of a pen, and that worries me. I'm sure that some of you don't see the accomplishments as enough, and I agree. Naturally, we want to know where we're going from here. Having taken one strong step forward, what can we do to maintain momentum? Well, I can't tell you exactly what our future is going to be. I can remind you that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today, representing our United Conservative Party. My name is David Hanson. I'm currently the MLA for Lackland St. Paul 2 Hills constituency. And due to the boundary changes, I'm running in the Cold Lake, Cold Lake St. Paul constituency. little bit about myself, 35 plus years in the oil and gas and construction industries. Started my apprenticeship at 17 years old and had a number of tickets by the time I was 21. Been through a few downturns in my lifetime in those 35 years. One of those in the late 80s where it was pretty tough to find a job just like it is today. And I went back to school, became a certified medical x-ray technologist. But because of the expenses of raising a family, I had to go back to the construction industry, which is a little bit more lucrative. As an MLA, it's been my pleasure to represent the constituency of Lac-La-Biche St. Paul Two Hills, which also includes Saddle Lake, Whitefish Lake, Beaver Lake, Heart Lake, as well as Buffalo Lake and Kikino Métis settlements. We also have the privilege of having one of the only Indigenous universities in the country, Blue Quills. And I've asked many questions in the House regarding funding for Blue Quills, because we typically get less than 20% of any other degree program in the province, which is a little frustrating. And yet those degree programs that we produce out of Blue Quills are recognized enough that our graduates have been hired by the University of Saskatchewan, University of Alberta to run their Indigenous programs. So a little frustrating from the opposition point of view when we ask questions to the Advanced Education Minister about funding and we don't get the answers we need. In addition to Blue Quills, we also have Portage College out in my area, which opportunities for a lot of people from the local reserves and communities to get an education right in their own community and advance to a degree program, and they could probably do that at Blue Quills University. I've probably been the Shadow Minister of Indigenous Relations for the last 3.5 years. A job that I've embraced and tried my best to learn. As Mr. Fian said, shut up and listen and try and learn something. I've really enjoyed having, and some of the things that I'm most proud of is my role in the promoting the 60s scoop. And, well documented, Adam North-Pagan will attest to it. He came to my office in 2017 after trying to communicate with the NDP government for 2 years and having the door shut. And it was only when I brought him in and introduced him in the House and forced the government to meet with them that we got something done there. I was also privileged to sit in a temporary role on the Child Intervention Panel when we dealt with the case of Serenity here in Edmonton, a child that died in care, which is one of the more important things, I think, with not only Treaty 8, but Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 as well here in the province. And it seems to be going on ongoing and doesn't seem to be really slowing down. It was one of the frustrations when I spoke regarding the 60s scoop, is that we can apologize for what happened in the past, but if we allow it to continue going on in the future, then what does the apology mean? I would also like to point out that I sat with our new Senator Paula Simons at the last blanket ceremony for Serenity, at which I was the only MLA from any party that participated in that as well. So if we want to talk about past actions that we've done in the last 3.5 years, I'm very proud of those. Our party, we stand for strong fiscal responsibility for all Alberta, and that includes First Nations. I intend to work very hard toward balanced and sustainable budgets in the future in my role as MLA. I also intend to proudly represent the new First Nations that are in my new riding, Cold Lake First Nation, Frog Lake, Kikino, and Saddle Lake, as well as two Métis settlements, Elizabeth Colony and Fishing Lake colonies. We need a robust and successful private sector, and that includes our First Nations. Up in the Cold Lake area, Bonnyville area, we do have some very, very successful companies. Pimco Denny comes to mind, Seven Lakes Oilfield Services, but they are also feeling the downturn, just like all other companies up in that area. So we do need, in order to fulfill our commitments to the social programs, education, healthcare that we are all very proud of in this province, we need a robust private sector to support those. Government does not produce jobs. Private sector produces jobs and produces income and fills the coffers of the province financially. So in that role, we as government, I think our role is to provide an environment that attracts investment and boosts people to start private businesses and get out there to work, and basically reduce the amount of regulation that is taking place that is stopping these folks from getting back to work. And that should be our role as government. I look forward to representing my constituency, and that includes all the Albertans who live in my area as well as First Nations, and I'm very proud to get out and meet as many of them as possible. I meet with our local chiefs, and I look forward to meeting some of the new First Nations, including Cold Lake and Frog Lake as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Armenta. If I could ask you to turn off your microphone. Thank you. So for anyone who's just joining us, either here in the audience or online, we're now moving into the question and answer portion for this evening's event. We have a number of questions that were developed and put forward today based on conversations around the table with Treaty 8 elders. I also want to point out that because we have a limited period of time tonight, there are only a limited number of questions. We're not going to be able to ask all of the questions that we put together today. However, in saying that, you can certainly anticipate another invitation to another such forum closer to the date, probably after the RIC drops. I imagine by then you'll have some platforms more fleshed out to share with us then. So I also want to remind people in the room to kindly take your conversations to the hallway and turn the ringers of your cell phones to silent or to turn them off. So without further ado, I will ask our lovely young people to get the questions ready. They're going to alternate questions. Each of our panelists will have 2 minutes to answer the question or address the question in some way, and we'll continue with the alphabetical approach to answering the questions. So, question number 1.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. The establishment of Aboriginal caucus. Do you support this idea? How would it look like?
So an Aboriginal caucus of elected chiefs or Indigenous leaders or something in the legislature?
It would just be, it's just a general, like whatever you could envision it as.
Well, actually, you know, I've been told by a previous Alberta Liberal leader that back in the period during the First World War in Alberta, in the Alberta legislature, there was actually 4 seats dedicated to Indigenous politicians to be elected to represent your community's rights and traditions in the Alberta legislature. And I would like for us to consider something similar to that. Although your nations are sovereign nations, and we believe in Alberta Liberals as a respectful nation-to-nation relationship, I think it's important for your leaders to be at the table in the Alberta legislature, because we'll have to work together much more closely in the future than we have in the past. We have to work as a team. We have to work together to address the problems that we all face. And so I think that we should look at returning to that practice where there's direct representation of Treaty 8, Treaty 6, Treaty 7 First Nations in the Alberta legislature. So I would like to look at a model like that.
Mr. Mendel, if either of you at any time need the question repeated, just ask.
No, I'm okay. I'm okay with the question. I think it's an interesting idea. Hopefully we'll be able to have several people from the First Nations running for us in an election, so there'll be a voice from that group of people within the caucus. But I think from the chief's point of view, I think having someone at the table on an ongoing basis to bring in an opinion to the the caucus, whether it's whoever it's those in government or those who are in opposition, would bring a lot of new ideas, new concepts, and understanding of where the First Nations might fit into, might allow them to be more involved in the decision-making process of the province. So I think it's a good idea. I guess what you want to have is a representative from each treaty, 6, 7, and 8, one individual who could be, I would guess, appointed by the regional chiefs, which will allow them to have input into, participation in the discussion, and bring a different perspective to the table. But I would hope that any of the parties, our party in particular, I hope to have several people from First Nations that would bring that vision to, and part of our discussion would be involved in making sure those opinions were heard, and that those ideas and values would be part of the decision-making process. So I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's not hard to do. It's just a matter of inviting people in to have to be part of the discussion. So I think it's an innovative idea, something that it's great to see people thinking about that's different, and it's a bit out of the ordinary. Good ideas. Thank you.
Mr. Fiat?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. The Alberta New Democrats have had an Indigenous caucus for very many years. They've been part of our party, helping to design our platforms each time. They have put together, a number of years ago, a full program of policies particular to the Indigenous community, which you can read anytime. I invite you to go to albertandp.ca, and you'll be able to find the Indigenous caucus policy guidelines. And right now we are seeking to have more ways to get input from the Indigenous community. As you know, I travel around the whole province pretty regularly, and as I've been stopping by in various meetings, whether it be Treaty 8 or the other treaty areas, asking people to seriously consider to come forward and to represent your communities by participating in the full process. You know that this year we passed a law in the legislature requiring that every First Nations have a voting station on the nation, so they don't have to travel somewhere in order to vote. And that's about inviting people in, having a voice. And we would like you to be there as our candidates. We would like you to be there as our campaign managers. We'd love you to be there as our campaign workers. But most importantly, we really want you to be there as our MLAs. And we have done a lot to ensure that the First Nations voice has been brought to the table. For example, every piece that comes to the cabinet now must have a section of it that refers to how will this policy affect First Nations people. And we do that to make sure we're bringing that First Nations voice forward. The best way to do that, though, would be to have First Nations people in the NDP. They're representing themselves and their communities in the legislature, and so we will do everything possible to ensure that you're there.
Thank you. Mr. Hanson?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question, very important question. As a matter of fact, and again, I don't like to shoot off the cuff, it can be checked back and answered, but over the last 3.5 years, at every opportunity during budget estimates, which is where we go over and we question line items on the budget that came forward, I've always questioned the ministry why there are no senior bureaucrats that are of native origin. And for 3.5 years, I've asked that question, why nobody was even invited from any of the First Nations around to sit in on the budget debates and talk. So I think it's a very, very important question, and I think you're absolutely right that we need more representation, but I think we need it if we have to start in the ministry where it is something that we can easily control. Thanks.
So we'll move to question 2, and then this will be the last order in alphabetical, and then I'm just going to shake it up a bit.
So the second question is, what is your understanding of treaty, and how are you going to uphold treaty number 8?
Mr. Khan?
Thank you. That's a really fundamental question, and as an Indigenous rights lawyer, I've spent many years learning about the historical injustices around the signing of the treaty, the lack of implementation of treaty promises, and it's something that I'm really passionate about, that these treaties were signed on behalf of Queen Victoria and the Federal Crown and First Nations leaders, and Treaty 8, especially in 1899 and 1900. And yet, most Albertans don't understand that we're all treaty people. We all must have a commitment to honoring the treaties, the number of treaties, especially Treaty 8 for the people in this room, and the promises made there. And it's a lack of education, which is something that we need to focus on in the education system, and it's demonstrated even by people like Mr. Kenny talking cavalierly about disposing of Crown lands because they're not covered by reserve lands, or that they're not treaty lands. Everything in Canada, everything in Northern Alberta, all the land is treaty land, and we're all treaty people. And I've worked hard in my career, both in the legal system and in organizing reconciliation dinners for community leaders in Calgary and area in the spring and summer of 2017, to try to encourage more people to understand that we all have to do our part to ensure that our commitments under the treaty are honored. And when they're not honored, we have to recognize those past failings and correct them the best we can. We shouldn't have to have lawyers like me having to step in and file claims and litigate over many years or decades. They should be honored by the governments. Thank you.
Mr. Mandel.
Thank you. It's nice that we have a lawyer up here that knows the law. I guess from my point of view as a layperson, the treaties were signed, they should be honored. But what historically seemed to happen is that those treaties have not been honored. They've been recognized, but they've been interpreted in a variety of ways by governments in power, and as a result of that, that's what's created the confusion. That's why different things have not happened, which each of the nations across our country have expected to happen. I think that's one of the great tragedies of why we are here today, why you're asking us questions about what you would do and what role you could play within a government in the province of Alberta, when you should have that inherent right as part of that treaty to determining your own destiny and your own future. So from the Alberta Party point of view, we believe the federal government must make sure that they abide by and understand all the rules and regulations set up under the treaties. But you know, what happens is that people tend to want to do the way they want to do it. So I think as a province, we need to make sure we work with First Nations to hold the government, the federal government responsible for their actions, and make sure the treaties are held up to the highest accord and that they're always respected. I know in the different times I've been with people, that's something that is the most important to the First Nations community, is the treaties and the rights that they've attained and retained over the period of time. So the Alberta Party deeply believes it's the responsibility of the federal government, but it's also responsibility of the provincial government to make sure we work with, to make sure that things are properly imposed upon all government levels.
Thank you. Mr. Hanson.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And again, the treaties are about mutual respect and mutual agreements that were made 120 years ago in this case. Alberta, Treaty 8 is the biggest treaty in Alberta. We also have a large Treaty 6 and Treaty 7, as well as portions of Treaty 10 and Treaty 4. So it's very important that I think the public be educated as to exactly what the treaties were about, what they meant. And I grew up in the area that I represent, lived my whole life. We're actually sixth generation on the land that my great-grandfather homesteaded there. So the stories that I heard as a kid were the mutual respect at that time that was taking place, and the fact that a lot of our ancestors, the European ancestors that came over here, would not have made it without the help of the natives of the day that helped them figure out how to find shelter and food and everything else like that. So we do owe a huge debt to those folks, and we, as a province, we need to respect the treaties as they stand and not trample over them and the rights of the First Nations peoples.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson. My apologies, Mr. Peter.
Thanks. I think this is probably one of the most fundamental questions that we have in our conversation today, what is treaty? Because the misunderstanding of what is treaty has been the root of so much of the disaster of the relationship between First Nations and non-First Nations in this province. There's a million things that can be said about treaty, but a couple of things are fundamentally important. One of them is that treaty was essentially an agreement to share the land. And that means to share all the benefits of the land. That means to share all the good things that come out of this province. And I can tell you that has not happened in the history of the province of Alberta. We have not shared the land appropriately. And that's what's got to change. We have to go back and we have to look at that. But the problem I found when I started to go around and talk to people about, hey, we agreed to share the land, and that means, we should be doing all these sorts of things. People looked at me with blank faces. And I learned right away that one of the very first things we need to do is we need to teach people that they are on treaty land. That treaty means something. And that you as a person who are living here in the province of Alberta, even if you're non-First Nations, are a signatory to that treaty. And so that's why we started doing all of the work we did in terms of making sure that it got into the school curriculum. For the first time in Alberta history, we're putting that in kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum. The people learn. They have to grow in their understanding so that they can respond to treaty. We're training everybody in the public service. 27,000 people are being put through a training right now. And, that's the kind of work that we have to do, because we have to ensure that the old jurisdictional divide between, you have to go and talk to the federal government, you don't get to talk to the provincial government, which has caused devastation in healthcare, in education, in community development, no longer continues. And we can only do that by raising up the level of understanding of all the people of Alberta and ensuring that treaty becomes fundamental to every single one of our conversations.
Yeah.
So we'll go to question number 3.
Question number 3. When First Nations talk about resource revenue sharing, what is your understanding of this, and would you move forward? Thanks.
So I'm going to call upon Mr. Mandel to be the first responder.
Sure, it's not that complicated. The resources are of the land. First Nations have the rights of the land. There needs to be a formula under which those that own the land share in those opportunities. So I think it's sitting down with the chiefs and the communities to find ways in which how the pie can be divided up. I don't think it's an issue of royalty, because I think it's an issue of ownership. When you go to, use an example, you go to countries like Saudi Arabia, they own the resource, and the business come in and they harvest that resource, and then the businesses make money from it, but so does the country. And I think the same way needs to happen with the First Nations, is they need to share in that resource revenue. What that percentage is and how it works is something that I wouldn't want to talk about just yet. I'm not sure of the numbers, but there needs to be a sharing of it. And the reason for that, it will allow the communities to build the kind of housing infrastructure they need to do. It's a sharing of the money that needs to happen, 50, 100 years ago, which I think was what was the intent of the sharing of the land. Unfortunately, right now, the land has not been shared in the sense of those resources. So we hope that that's one thing we could work out, find a way to share the opportunity and the benefit, which would accrue then to the communities.
Thank you. I will ask Mr. Thean.
Thank you. I think you've heard me say that I do believe that we need to be sharing the land and that all the benefits of the land in greater ways. We have not as a province done that very well over the years at all. And so over the last just over 3 years that the NDP have been in government, we've been looking at ways to bring that forward in new ways. So we signed the Cascanal agreement so that we can move that forward in education. We brought more money to women's shelters and to healthcare and midwives and so on in northern Alberta. We brought $100 million to bring water to reserves around the province. $150 million in terms of climate leadership into the First Nations communities. About $100 million in off-reserve housing. if I can go through the number of things that we've done, that we've been really trying to make sure that we are moving the resources of the community into First Nations community. In fact, just a quick run off the top of my head, I can list over $500 million new dollars that have been brought into the First Nations communities, because it's a reflection of our commitment to share the land and to share the benefits of the resources that we have in this province. It's also why we've made sure that we've done things like, when we develop a new park, we're signing cooperative management agreements with the local First Nations so that they begin to have the say over the land, so that they have that authority over the land. And those are the kinds of things that we've been doing over the last little while. We know there's a long way to go. The platforms are not completely written, and I really encourage you, come, join our party, join our Indigenous caucus, get into that platform, the things that you want to see in the next election. This is an excellent time to participate, because we're still putting things together, and our platform from the last election, we fulfilled almost 100% of the things that we committed to do the last time, and we intend to do that again.
Thank you, Mr. Bien. Mr. Matson.
Thank you again. Great question. Resource revenue sharing. Just like to point out a couple things. Number one is the Indigenous relations portion of the budget is one of the smallest ministries in the entire provincial budget, only surpassed by the brand newly formed women's ministry. And in 2019 or 2018, we're spending $1.9 billion just in debt servicing. So the Indigenous relations portion of the entire budget is 1/8 of what we'll be spending just to service debt in this province this year and next year. And it gets even worse as we go to 2023 when we hit $3.4 billion. I think a good example of the revenue sharing idea comes through with the Eagle Spirit pipeline corridor through from Fort McMurray to northern BC, where they've actually done it in the right direction. Instead of trying to pick a route and then try and get everybody to buy into it, they've got all the First Nations on that route to buy into it, with the idea that they would be part owners of that pipeline, of any power line or anything that goes through there, and their communities would see the opportunities that would come from that development and the money that comes into that. I did find it a little bit surprising when we met with Chief Noski a couple of weeks back there that we talked about this issue and the fact that when there's development on Crown land that's adjacent to First Nations reserves, that there's no compensation for loss of use. Whereas if it was private land or privately held lease, the leaseholder or the landowner would get loss of use revenue. So I think that's something that definitely would need to be looked at. But again, projects like the Eagle Spirit corridor are the way to go in the future, I think, and to get the buy-in from all the communities so that they see some of the prosperity. We heard some stories from Chief Guru where young people. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Khan.
Well, that's a really fundamentally important issue for all of our futures going forward, because we're not going to be able to develop our resources and get them to market without partnering with First Nations across this country. Going back to a quick history lesson, it's easy to forget that Alberta wasn't even created until 5 years at a minimum after all the treaties were concluded that cover the area that became Alberta. And Alberta didn't get its control of its lands and resources until 1930, when the National Resource Transfer Agreement was concluded. The NRTA had specific sections that ensured that the promises made to First Nations, both oral and written, pursuant to the number of treaties, were to be protected. And unfortunately, over many years, we've forgotten as a society and as governments that those promises were protected by that legislation and then by Section 35 of the Constitution Act. We've got politicians all across this country misrepresenting. I don't want to say use the word lying, but I've got to give them, I've got to be generous and believe that they just don't understand the situation. But saying things like the notwithstanding clause should be used to override First Nations and Indigenous rights and get projects going. That's not the reality, and that would be an illegal act. We've got to work together to partner. We have to work on equity agreements on resource projects and on projects like pipeline corridors. I wasn't surprised when the Federal Court of Appeals struck down the permits for the Trans Mountain Pipeline construction. I wasn't surprised because I've seen for many years how consultation and accommodation isn't followed. We have to do better.
Thank you. So now go to question 4.
There is a high percentage of Indigenous people accessing services and programs who are homeless, at risk, marginalized, and vulnerable. How would you ensure that Indigenous people are involved in the development and funding decisions of these programs and services?
We'll start with Mr. Fia.
Thank you very much. Well, I think many of you would know that I was a social worker for about 33 years before I got elected, and one of the areas I worked a lot in is the area of concern around overrepresentation in a number of areas like homelessness and other issues in the Indigenous community. One of the things that I'm constantly trying to get people to understand, though, is it's not about choices that individual Indigenous people have made. It's structural problems in society. It's the way we organize things. Everything from how people get their money, how people are treated when they arrive, the racism that's involved. And those are the kinds of issues we have to look at. We have to look at how do we make sure that people can have the opportunity to move forward. And as a result, we've been doing a lot to ensure that there's success with things like education. We put a lot of extra money into mental health right now for people at post-secondary institutions to ensure that when they get there, they can be successful and they can move on. We have put almost $1 billion over the next few years into creating more affordable housing across the province of Alberta, and all of which will be available to First Nations and Indigenous people. So we need to have all of those structural changes made so that Indigenous people can be successful. And we need them at the table to be talking about it. So when we designed our housing plan, the only way you can apply for the Indigenous housing portion of it is if an Indigenous community group is actually going to be receiving the money. So they're at the table making the decision about how the housing should be designed, who it should be designed for, what kind of mechanisms should be put in to make sure people have a voice, and what kind of procedures should we have to make sure that ceremony can be accommodated in these facilities, in these homes.
Mr. Hanson.
Well, thank you. Thanks for mixing it up. Okay, access and services and the overrepresentation. Very interesting question up in my area where the St. Paul actually happens to be the hub for mental health in our area in northeastern Alberta, so we do have some unique challenges up there. I think the number one thing is that no matter how remote or where you live in this province, we need to have access to positive choices and positive opportunities. I had alluded in my last question to the conversation I had with Chief Guru and his concern about, he said he wasn't so concerned about getting another pipeline built, he's concerned about the youth suicide rate in his community. We had an incident, shouldn't call it an incident, but a young person out at the Frog Lake Reserve, 7 years old. You have to wonder what's going through a child's mind at 7 years old to make them commit suicide. And I think this is where we have to, as a community and as a province, we really have to address access to education, proper access to health care at opportune times, and the support for people no matter where they live in the province or how remote they are.
Thank you. Mr. Mandel.
Thank you. Homelessness is one of the saddest things that any society can face, and to get the First Nations involved is vitally important. I think that in communities across the province of Alberta. I think reaching out to the elders, having them get more actively involved, helping them bring their sense of history, their sense of tradition to the discussion be vitally important. We can do all the funding we want, but there needs to make sure that people still have an identity to who they are, what they're about. And I think that's part of the problem. We tend to forget that these are people that came from difficult times and have a great challenge. And how do we then get them to the next step? We get all kinds of housing, all kinds of supports. It is a huge problem, but it will not be solved unless we work together. It really is about building community. And I think a big part of it is that there's this misconception that more can't be done. More can be done with less money if we just reach out to people and have them come together. In Edmonton, when we had our homelessness strategy, one of the great problems we found with people who were homeless, when they then got a place to live, loneliness. They couldn't go back to their old friends because their old friends would cause them the same trouble they had before. And so Archbishop Smith from obviously the Catholic Church came up with a program where people would reach out, they'd become friends. We need to create friends with people. If we're going to get individuals to try to find a new way to live, they can't be left alone. And I think it's vitally important that we do that. And so more can be done, but it's about all of us reaching out and caring more. And not being so concerned that we can't build facilities across cities, across the province to help people. This is a horrific thing to see people's lives destroyed. And it's not their fault. It's because of circumstances in their lives that made things so difficult. So I think we can do a heck of a lot more.
Question 5.
Oh, you didn't hear me.
Oh, my bad. Sorry, Mr. Khan.
No worries, thank you very much. I've been really proud and happy with the work that I've done over the years in litigation, for example, the fight for fair education funding on and off reserve. And I've seen firsthand the issues and problems your communities face. I think, number one, we have federal and provincial government have to respect the sovereignty of First Nations governments. But as between the federal and provincial governments, we have to stop the fighting and the blaming each other and the dividing up responsibilities in an arbitrary way between these levels of government and then causing divisions between off and on reserve people accessing services. The Alberta government has to step up and ensure that things like the Jordan's Principle are implemented and respected for education, for healthcare, for other services, for First Nations and Indigenous people accessing these services on or off reserve in larger urban centers and smaller urban centers. So we really need to focus on people and on outcomes and look at better ways of doing things. For example, housing first strategy. So ensuring that people have housing is the number one thing that can help them throughout their lives, rather than requiring that other issues that they're dealing with, health or addiction issues, have to be addressed first. What we're really finding, number one, is that housing must be addressed first, and then those other challenges can be much easier met later. And provincial governments have to step in and work directly with First Nations people, whether they're on reserve or off reserve, and work as a team to really address these situations and not work in our silos. So thank you.
Question 5. Access to healthcare. What is your party's platform on rural/remote First Nation community like home care?
We'll start with Mr. Hansen.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the question. Access to healthcare is currently an issue that we're trying to address in my communities. And we're not as remote as a lot of the Treaty 8 communities are, but even in the areas St. Paul and Bonnyville, we do have issues with access to healthcare and timely access to healthcare. we used to have this great facility in Edmonton called the Municipal Airport that we used to be able to fly in from Northern Alberta and have quick access to the Royal Alex Hospital, which would have been, a couple of minutes away. I've even heard cases where when the traffic was stopped up, that the pilot and crew whipped people over by gurney over to the hospital. Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of that. I think that's probably one of the worst things that's happened for healthcare access to Northern Alberta in the last 15 years. So unfortunately, that ship has sailed, but we're trying to get better access. That was fundamental in getting the dialysis unit moved into the Lac-La-Biche Hospital, where it used to be on a bus that was broken down in the parking lot, and people had to climb up the 3 stairs. And when you're going in for dialysis and you're kind of on your last legs, it's a real trouble. But I have to give kudos to the health minister for coming up there right after the election, and I showed it to her, and we got that fixed up, and we now have a state-of-the-art facility in Lac-La-Biche. They have a CT scanner that's just about ready to come into full operation. So we are working on providing closer access to our remote communities, and I think we have a long way to go, but also improving access and emergency access from our remote communities to centers like Edmonton and Calgary are fundamentally important.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Khan.
Thank you. As I mentioned previously, First Nations people access healthcare and education both on reserve, that might be a federal responsibility, but many of those services are off reserve and in the cities and in rural areas and in smaller rural centers. So again, we have to ensure as a provincial government that those services are provided to all Albertans and to First Nations members, whether they live on reserve or off reserve, and really focus on that. One thing our party is really passionate about is preventing health issues from becoming worsening and requiring expensive intervention and long hospital stays. So preventative care is really key. So bolstering home care programs is really important so that people can stay in their communities and not get to the point where they have to be airlifted to a hospital or access a hospital and have expensive medical intervention. Dr. Swan, who's our Liberal MLA who chaired the Valuing Mental Health report in 2016, had over 30 recommendations for mental health and addictions funding. We have to remember that mental health and addictions, that's a huge part of healthcare. And right now we're only spending 6% of our healthcare budget on mental health and addictions. And as we all know, mental health and addictions can hurt us in so many ways. Problems with mental health can affect your physical health, and addictions problems, when they're not addressed, can affect not only ourselves but our families and communities. So we need to take much more focus on a forward-thinking strategy to make sure that everyone has access to those services and to preventative care and community care, and everyone can be healthier. Thanks.
Mr. Mandel.
Thank you. First of all, I think we would look at decentralizing the healthcare system, so not as many things are controlled out of Edmonton and Calgary. We'd move things out to our community level so they can make decisions about what they need, which will allow them to allocate more money to home care, which is really something that is sadly needed across rural Alberta. It's something that's really in need. I think we need to train more nurse practitioners. Nurse practitioners are people that have great skill sets, and we don't have enough of them in the province right now, so I think that we need to have our nursing schools make an effort to begin to look at how we can expand the services of nurse practitioners, look at how we can train more people to be participants in the healthcare system in rural Alberta and creating more incentives to stay there. I think by decentralizing, we'll create a much better opportunity for things to be invested in these communities. Right now, too much is centralized in both Edmonton and Calgary. And healthcare is something that is not just about acute care. It is about mental health. It's about services in a variety of different ways. And so again, I go back to this decentralization by allowing communities to have more control of the future of what they're going to invest in for their health care. I think you'll be able to have them make the decision of how they can do a better job and deal with the problems they face. And so with First Nations, sometimes it's a challenge because it's a bit distant out and they need to have that support. So hopefully training more nurse practitioners to help within those communities to make a big difference. So I think changing the model, looking at doing things differently, will be able to give better service to people across the province of Alberta.
Mr. Fiat?
I think this is a fundamental question because it really divides us in many ways between the parties here. For a long time, the New Democrats have been the champions of universal public health care. We invented it in Saskatchewan, we brought it across this country, and we've been the defenders when, in this province, the Conservative parties, now say plural on the side, have been attacking healthcare continuously, moving toward privatization regularly. Under the budget that they ran when Mr. Mandel was health minister, and then they ran under the last budget, they proposed a $1 billion cut to healthcare moving into that election. One of the very first things we did when we got elected was we stopped that $1 billion cut. And Jason Kenney over the last year has suggested that there will be cuts across services, including up to 20% cuts. And that includes healthcare. And if they're going to be looking for ways to cut on healthcare, they're going to be looking for the places where it costs more. And I can tell you it does cost more to deliver in rural areas. And so your healthcare is in danger under these kind of conservative budgets. We have been very careful to make sure that while we didn't have tons of new money, we were able to maintain the services that were there without massive cuts, without taking away the things that are important to you. But we also did many things that were really important, such as the Valley Mental Health Program, which we invited other parties into to participate in. We also made sure that there was money for nursing care and for midwifery on reserved communities. And I know that our Minister of Children's Services, Danielle Larrabee, who's our candidate in Slave Lake, has been a huge advocate for ensuring that appropriate health care is available for all of your communities. She helped to lead that Valley Mental Health Care Program and so many of the other ones, which I'll get to later.
So, I have an assistant now, Greg, who's going to help me let you guys know when it's 10 seconds with a big 10 sign, so you don't feel abruptly cut off when I give you the time. So we'll go to question number 6.
What can we do to have better relations between interprovincial child welfare, for instances where our children are involved in other provinces' child welfare programs and services?
We'll start with Mr. Khan.
Well, again, this is a situation where legal parameters and jurisdictional parameters get in the way of individuals and their well-being, and there's nowhere more tragic and disturbing as when those issues get in the way of a child's health or life. And I've been really passionate about ensuring that children have working on claims that involve ensuring that children have access to and are properly treated by provincial governments across Western Canada, where I've worked in the last 8 years. I was really very honored and pleased to meet Cindy Blackstock in Calgary a couple of years ago when she spoke, and she's been the real advocate fighting for child welfare issues and the proper treatment of children across this country. We've got to take the lead of leaders and heroes like her and really listen to her and her team and others like her who have been working for many years on this incredibly tragic issue. I don't need to tell you that 60% of the children in care in Alberta are First Nations or Indigenous descent when it's only about 10% of the actual population of children in Alberta. And this issue is mirrored across the country, and especially in places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So again, as we need to work better between governments and not impose these artificial boundaries within a province, we also have to work much better with First Nations governments and other provincial governments across the country to ensure that the best interests of the child, of all of our children, are focused on. Thank you.
We'll go to Mr. Mandel.
Thank you. We can't seem to agree on anything between provinces these days, which is really sad. Forgetting pipelines, but even license plates, all kinds of things. And what's more important than our children? And I think that that's indicative of the problems we face in our country today, about why we can't come together and find solutions to problems and why we're having so much trouble within our country. So to say that we're not able to solve the problems of interprovincial issues with children's welfare is sad. Children should take a priority over everything. But for some reason, like everything else we seem to do in this country, when it goes from one province to the other, we fight. And we want to control the destiny and the control of everything. And so it's a sad relationship we have, which has been developed under the British North America Act, or however it's evolved. And half the problems of the First Nations have developed because of the lack of understanding and lack of willing to work together. This is no different. And I think working together is a much better way to do things, but it just doesn't seem it's in the cards. And it's very sad because it hurts people, it hurts children. At the end of the day, aren't we supposed to do better for people? Whether it's politicians or whether it's the chiefs, we all want to do better for our children to make life better. But if we can't even get along when it comes to a child's issue interprovincially, boy, we got lots of problems. So I would hope we could sit down, minister to minister or premier to premier, and find ways to solve that. But I don't have a lot of confidence anymore in that. I think our country's really gone in the wrong direction the last number of years, and whether it's because of what I don't want is comment on whatever that is, but it's a problem we face, and it's something we really, really need to change, and hope we become a country again rather than 10 provinces and territories and a federal government, everybody doing for themselves, not worrying about anybody else. That doesn't build a country. That builds separation, that builds problems.
Thank you. I think this is a major problem that really requires some significant leadership. And I think right now we're getting some leadership. Mr. Larrabee has, of course, put together this whole child review panel, and they've been talking on many different issues. Now is an excellent time to bring the interprovincial jurisdictional issues forward, because that could be included in that kind of a dialogue that's going on. What we're seeing in terms of the conversations between government and all the nations in terms of child welfare is at a very high level compared to where it's ever been in the past. And so that kind of leadership is going to bring us to where we need to go. You know, we've demonstrated that with the 60 Scoop, for example. We put together a big process working with, well, first of all, the development of the 60 Scoop Survivor Society to talk about children who've come into care. And we worked very closely, First Nations individuals and the government, to create a process that was really guided by First Nations people. And then we went around the province and we talked to over 800 people who were affected by the 60 Scoop and heard all of their stories. And then we did an apology. It was that kind of process, working hand in hand with First Nations, really worked. So much so that the province of Saskatchewan not only adopted our whole process, but actually brought our people from Alberta into Saskatchewan to help them run that process. And that's leadership, and that's what you're getting from the NDP, is leadership on child welfare moving forward. And I can tell you, we have a very, very long way to go in terms of resolving child welfare issues. A lot of attention has to be paid to this, and we really welcome you to participate with our party in developing some pretty strong new interventions, and not only within the province of Alberta, but interjurisdictionally as well.
Thank you again for another important question. It's a kind of a perfect example of what I was speaking to earlier in one of my previous answers to the questions. When we spoke to the 60 scoop survivors in the legislature during the apology, one of the board members, her name is Sharon, when she was taken from her grandparents, it was 4 siblings, and rather than keep them all together, they separated them all and sent them to different provinces, one even down to Montana, down into the States. So a lot of this doesn't make any sense at all to me, and the problem during that apology and what I spoke about was that it continues to happen today. And that's where we have to address it. We have to stop this stuff from happening, keep kids in the community wherever possible, and when it's not possible, they should not even be leaving the province. So I think that's how we address it. There's not much we can do to address the past and what's happened in the past, but we can definitely put a stop to it and prevent it from happening in the future.
So we'll go on to question 7.
What is your party's view on compensation for trappers, particularly the trappers who are hard hit by industry's activities that curtail their ability to trap?
We'll start with Mr. Mandel.
Well, I think anytime any kind of industry impacts another industry, they should be compensated. It's the question of how do you compute the difference? How do you compute the costs that people have incurred? I think that's one of the challenges we face in the province of Alberta, is we are a resource-based province, and so therefore we're going to be impacting the land, impacting people who are hunting and fishing on it and creating their livelihood. So there should be formulas under which we should easily be able to figure out what the compensation should be. And so compensating people shouldn't be an overly onerous issue. It should be able to be done. It's just a matter of coming up with a simple formula that, this is what we've earned, this is what you've impacted, this is what we should get in return for it. So I think it's not a complicated issue. That's one that I think should be part of the responsibility when people do the planning for resource development or development on lands, to make sure that people get the proper compensation. So that's as much as I know about that.
Thank you. Mr. Behan.
Thank you. I think that we have to start by recognizing that trapping is essential and fundamental to treaty rights in this province. And when you start at that basis, then of course anything you do to infringe on those rights through industry or anything else need to be compensated appropriately. And we've been doing a number of things to try to make sure we move on that. As you may know, I've been doing a review of the consultation process in this province for the last couple of years. Anytime somebody wants to affect the land, they want to cut a tree, dig a hole, do anything that's going to affect treaty rights, then they need to be able they need to talk to the nations that are affected. And we've been really working together with all the Indigenous communities around this province to move forward and making sure that that consultation is happening every single time, and that includes with trappers. And in addition to that, strong emphasis on continual conversation and compensation. We've also worked with the Treaty 8 Trappers Association. We've signed a historic first agreement, MOU, with the Treaty 8 Trappers this year that will ensure a number of things. It will ensure that there's money for educating the next generation to be trappers. Ensure that if a line is not used for a little while because somebody's ill, it doesn't get lost back to the government. It stays with the nation. The nation has the first right to keep those trap lines. And ensures that if ever anybody does anything industry-wise or government-wise that's going to interfere with that trap line, that they must consult with the individual trapper as well. Not just the nation, but the individual trapper. And make sure that they are trying to mitigate wherever possible, to try to reduce the effect on the trap line, and whenever possible to find some kind of accommodation and make a change. So we've already actually been moving a lot in this particular area. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Behan. Mr. Hanson.
Thank you. And again, I think we kind of touched this a little bit on one of the previous questions, but when we had the meeting with Chief Noski and Chief Guru and others a couple of weeks back, I was a little bit surprised to hear that adjacent Crown land, when it was adjacent to First Nations or involved a trap line, that there was no compensation for that development for loss of use. Whereas if I'm a farmer or a leaseholder and I hold a township of cattle grazing lease, any disturbance on there, I would be entitled to some compensation. So I'm a little surprised that we're not there. So I think it's definitely something, a tool that we could look at to help out and alleviate the situation.
Thank you. So, Mr. Khan?
Thanks very much. That, again, is a really important question. It goes back to the basic fundamentals that the number of treaties, and Treaty 8 in particular, promised you that you could continue your way of life, hunting, trapping, and fishing on Crown land, which at that time was most of the area of northern Alberta. In the last 120 years, there's been so many resource developments, so many more people moving into your traditional territories, and there hasn't been that recognition, and there still really isn't that recognition, both at the political leadership level and just by ordinary Albertans, that your rights don't end at the end of your border of your reserve. You have those constitutionally protected treaty rights to hunt, trap, and fish in your traditional territories. So it's really important to recognize that, and to recognize that those are rights that must be protected, and that kind of impact can't really be compensated for by money or damages if you lose those opportunities. So we have to minimize the effect of development on those important and protected rights, and ensure that where they are damaged or you lose access to those lands, that there is proper compensation from the federal and provincial governments. So I want to be your advocate. I understand the issues. I want to work cooperatively with you and your First Nations governments to make sure that these fundamental things are understood, so that we don't need to. You don't need to hire lawyers like me to expensively litigate these issues over years and decades, and it ends up wasting government money, it wastes your money, and you lose those rights.
Thank you. So we'll move to question 8, please.
There are situations where we are being criminalized for exercising our constitutionally protected rights, such as hunting and fishing. What is to your knowledge of our constitutionally protected rights, and what would your party do to address this?
Mr. Fian?
Thank you. Well, we got to start with the position that hunting, fishing, and trapping are treaty rights, period. And that's the law that should govern everything that happens after that. And it's become really clear that there's been all these sort of practices over time that have infringed on that, rules and regulations that interfere. But I think the NDP recognize that they are rights, and fundamentally, by their very nature, need to be respected wholly and completely. And that the work that we have to do now is we have to figure out what does that mean and how does that live out on the land. And it's something that has not been done well in this province for the last 44 years or more, and something that needs to change right now. And we're more than prepared to sit down and spend time with Treaty 8 chiefs and talk about how do we actually make sure that their inherent right to hunting, fishing, and trapping is protected. And that's the work that we've been starting now, and that's the work that we're going to continue. And our intention is to make sure that every one of you has a right to practice all of those rights where you want to and when you want to. There are very few times that we want to infringe on people's rights, and there may be a time when you're trying to protect some wildlife or some fish for a short period of time in a very small particular location that you want to ask everybody not to fish or hunt in that particular location. But that should be done in consultation with the nations. We should be sitting down with the nations having the conversation where we say, okay, our understanding is that this lake is being fished out, so what should we do about it? And that's the kind of conversation that we should be having. And so the limitation comes not from government, but from all of us agreeing the best way to move forward is to conserve the environment, conserve the animals on the land, and then fish in the water. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hanson?
Thank you. Looking at Chief Nosky because I think he's got personal interest in this question. Yeah, I think it comes down again to education, and the enforcement officers need to be educated into exactly what the treaty rights are and recognizing those rights as well. And it also comes down to a little bit of common sense. And I'll give you a prime example of that, something that just happened here last fall, where a Métis group up in Conklin had taken a bunch of youth out to teach them traditional methods of netting and smoking fish. They thought they were within the right because a couple of guys had a license, but when the enforcement officers came there, they blew a gasket, arrested a couple of the guys. But worse than that is they took all of these fish that were already hanging, smoking, and threw them in a dumpster. They didn't even allow these folks to finish. Okay, maybe somebody was guilty, let's deal with that issue, but that community and those elders and kids should have been allowed to at least fulfill and not waste that meat. And I think that's a frustrating part for me, is the lack of common sense, I think, when we're dealing with a lot of these issues. And I think education is fundamental in dealing with those. Thanks.
Mr. Khan?
Thanks. Yeah, well, I've touched on the real core of this issue, is that treaty rights to hunt, trap, and fish are constitutionally protected rights that can't be abrogated or infringed on without proper consultation, and cannot just be unilaterally trampled on by provincial or federal governments. One thing I've come to understand over many years in fighting with the federal government and provincial and territorial governments about Indigenous and treaty rights is there needs to be much stronger leadership from the top. Even when there's a change in government, as there was federally in 2015, it continued to be years of fighting with government lawyers and bureaucrats. Even when we would quote the Prime Minister's mandate letters to his Justice and Indigenous Affairs ministers, the lawyers and bureaucrats wouldn't take them seriously. So the ship of state takes a long time to turn around, but there needs to be much more leadership from the top to ensure that wildlife officers, that lawyers that are prosecuting criminal or regulatory infractions with respect to hunting, fishing, or other uses of the land, that there's much better direction given to them about what should or should not be criminalized and what should or should not be pursued in our courts or through our regulatory systems. So I'm committed to raising those issues and fighting on your behalf in the Alberta legislature to make sure that there's a real change at the top that will ensure that less and less of this happens. But it's still, and I'm just so shocked at how many times First Nations are prosecuted, people are prosecuted when they shouldn't. Thanks.
If I can just quickly remind people to take your conversations outside. We can really hear them on this side of the room. Mr. Mandel?
Thank you. We've talked a great deal today about rights of First Nations and those rights to exist, which I believe they do. And we've also talked about environmental care, and I no question that First Nations care far more about the environment than most other people and organizations in this country. So not allowing you to have harvesting rights is a bit silly to me. Who else is be careful, drown yourself. Who else is going to take care of the land more than the First Nations? And if there's no fish to fish, you're not going to fish anymore. So I think it is silliness to say that you're going to take all the fish and not worry about it anymore. It's ridiculous. Or all the deer. That's not to your benefit. So protecting the environment has been historically what the First Nations have stood for. So the Alberta Party believes that harvesting rights should be easily determined, and you get on with life and go ahead and do what you need to do. Just be careful and take care of the land like I know you will. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll go to question number 9.
How would your party strike a balance between resource development and protection of the environment?
We'll start with Mr. Mandel, please.
Well, that's a $64,000 question, which is, for those of you who are older, know that that was a game show many, many decades ago. I think number one, we have to protect the environment over resource development. You know, there's no question in my mind in today's world we can be much more cautious, much more careful of how we take care of our environment. For too long, it's been the secondary issue because the pressure and the desire to develop a resource has been far more substantial than making sure we protect what we have. And so I think it's just setting in place proper environmental standards and making sure that the companies abide by them. Orphan wells are just not acceptable. Things that we've allowed in the past need to be changed. I think we can do a much better job. And I think that working with First Nations and understanding that their love of the land and how they believe things can be developed will be a great aid to us to understand how we can build a much better province. But if we just take the resources and rape the land, we're not going to have much left. So let's find a way to find a much better balance, and so we can have the respect of the world about what we do, not necessarily an awful lot of disdain from many people around the world, because the Albertans do care deeply about the environment, but somehow our reputation has not been what it should be. And so we need to do a better job telling the people what we're doing, how we're doing it, but also make sure we do it in a way that's very effective, so we secure the future for yourselves and your children, so that Alberta is a place we want to all come to in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a pretty fundamental question here, because one of the things that's been happening in the province in the past is that people have been put into two different camps. Either you're protecting the environment or you're interested in economic development. And we know that Jason Kennedy has said that he's very interested in that. He's going to sell off all kinds of land in northern Alberta and so on, and that he is going to go ahead and do all kinds of things without consultation, he said, this summer, to make sure that pipeline goes through and so on. And we, as the NDP, have said that we can do both at the same time. You can protect the environment and you can have economic development. You've been doing that for years. You've been doing that for many centuries. And it's perfectly possible that we continue to do that. When we try to move ahead on one hand, like we try to protect the Castle Wilderness, or most recently the Bighorn Wilderness area, which protects the headwaters of the waters that we all drink, all of a sudden, UCP people get up in arms and get crazy and start to tell us they can't do that kind of thing. Then when we try to go ahead and we try to create economic development on the other hand, then people come forward and tell us that we're not protecting the land. And I can tell you that we have done both. We've had significant economic development in this province. We are encouraging it every day. At the same time, we've created 5 new provincial parks and a biodiversity area in Treaty 8 area. And in each one, we have asked First Nations to come forward and to be cooperative managers of that land with us. So that's how we do it. We do it by having you at the table. We do it because we are supporting First Nations groups in terms of getting ownership of the energy system. Through our electricity market, we've had 3 nations take ownership of it in the last month. We also have been working with groups that are looking to buy the pipeline. First Nations groups, we've been supporting them financially in terms of keeping their organization together. We're doing the economic development, and at the same time, we're taking care of the land because we have the First Nations there at all times.
Yeah, it's fundamentally important to protect our environment while also ensuring that there's good jobs for all Albertans and obviously also for First Nations people and Indigenous people in across the country. The Alberta Liberal Party, we really do care about the environment, and we also walk the walk to demonstrate that. For example, we've opposed the NDP's allowing clear cutting in the Highwood and Kananaskis area that would hurt our watersheds and the land there. There's a way of ensuring a strong forestry industry without allowing mass clear cutting of environmentally sensitive areas like the eastern slopes of our Rocky Mountains. Another issue that we brought to the fore is we called for an emergency debate this past legislative session for the reclamation costs of oil sands developments and pipelines and oil well developments across the province. Both the NDP and the UCP and the Alberta Party opposed our calling for that emergency debate. This was in the context of the government's own report, senior official in charge of reclamation indicating the costs might be $260 billion to reclaim our lands and waters that have been affected by the oil and gas industry. We called for an emergency debate because we wanted to see real solutions at the table. Other jurisdictions like Texas and California have an oil patch cleanup bond. It's like an insurance system to make sure that there's the money there in the future to deal with these liabilities, which could be as much as $260 billion or more. So we're committed and have provided real leadership in the legislature on environmental issues, and will continue to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Hanson.
Thank you. And again, another great question. As I said before, I spent most of my life working in this industry, and I can guarantee you, at least up in the area that I worked for the last 25 years, which was mostly up in the Air Weapons Range north of Bonnyville, nobody goes to work and says, boy, you know what, I want to have an oil spill today, or I want to ruin a water body. I really do believe that the people that work in our oil and gas industry, especially up in our area, they live there, they hunt there, they fish there, they take their kids out to the lake on weekends. Nobody is more concerned about the environment than the folks that work up there, and I really do have to believe that. On our sites, on my sites that I supervised, we didn't even dump potable water on the ground after a hydro test that was hauled away to a sales tank. So, you know, that being said, resource development should benefit everybody in the area, and it shouldn't be just a select few that benefit from it, and it definitely shouldn't be at the expense of our environment or our future. Thanks.
So good. Question 10.
How do you see climate change? Moving forward to include Indigenous people and our knowledge.
We'll start with Mr. Khan.
Climate change is one of the existential issues of our time, of our generation. And as the youngest leader of a political party here in Alberta, I'm especially passionate about that issue because I'm really concerned about our future generations, about my relatives, about my niece, about the environment that future generations are going to be living in this world. It's something that we fundamentally must address, reducing carbon emissions. We can do that while continuing to innovate in our industries. If we really put our minds to it, we've got to have a credible plan for reducing carbon emissions. Continue to ensure that our industry, the gas industry and other industries are can continue creating jobs that we all and revenues that we rely on for our social programs. And First Nations people have had a historic connection to this land and this area, and must be included in those plans because you have the knowledge and the history to help us all understand the changes that our climate is undergoing, that our environment is undergoing, and you can help us understand how critically important addressing climate change is for all of us in the room and for all of our future generations. So I'm really committed to making sure that you're at the table when we have those discussions and really drawing on your historical knowledge of Canada to help us in that regard. Thanks.
fairly, the NDP, the Democratic government, has been very concerned about climate change. For the very first time in this province, we have a provincial climate change policy. And it's a reflection of what you've been telling me since the day that I've met many of you. That is, things are changing on the land, and if we don't take care of the land, we are going to lose it, not only for ourselves, but for many, many generations to come. And we have taken a very bold, strong stance and put together our Climate Leadership Initiative that is considered one of the best climate change plans in North America. And I can tell you, it's under direct attack. The UCP had promised to make it their very first policy, and they repeated this hundreds of times in the House. Their very first act in the House will be to destroy the Climate Leadership Plan. That means all of those projects have been done. The 30 nations amongst you that have put up solar panels, the $85 million over the last 2 years, which is going to be $150 million by the end of the next year, for the climate leadership programs where you do the retrofits in your communities and you build participation in the environmental system, the energy systems, through renewable energies. This year, 3 nations participated and are producing 300 megawatts of renewable energies. All of that is going to be taken away, including the climate leadership rebates that many people receive in your communities. All of that's at risk this summer. But we have taken a very strong stance to move forward on, and it has been admired by people around the world, and we need to stick with it. If we let this go, we are going to be damaging the earth in a way that's going to be irreparable for generations. And if you want to pass on the earth to your children, you need to take a strong stance now. And I encourage you to come forward, to participate with us, to tell these parties that climate change is real and it's man-made and it's our responsibility to resolve it.
Thank you for that impassioned comments. There's no question that the First Nations are not the ones that screwed up the land. And there's no question that you're the ones that have protected the land and really have taught so many people the importance of maintaining the importance of the beauty of the land, the quality of the land, and the traditional part of the land plays in your lives. So I think not having you at the table, not understanding what you can bring as far as understanding the importance of the land, the importance of what we can do to make a better place to live for all of us is foolish. There's no question climate change is an issue. Whether or not provincial program is good or bad, I'm not here to pass judgment on it. But the question was about how do we work with First Nations? They bring you to the table, listen to what you've done historically, listen to how we can become better partners, listen to how we can change what we do to make Alberta a better place for everybody. It's just not the First Nations have a vested interest in climate change. It's my grandson does too. It's all of our children do. And so we have to make an effort to make a better life for everybody. How we do it is through consensus, not dictatorship. I think really if we get together, we can do a heck of a lot better job than we're doing now. I'm not casting judgment on that. I think we can do better by working together, and that you can bring so much to the table to allow us to change how we do things to make life better for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And it's no doubt that we are facing crises all over the world when it comes to climate change. 7 billion people now reside on this planet, called this planet home. That population has doubled just over the last 30 years, and at the rate we're going, it will double again in short order. So to sit back and ignore it and pretend that mankind doesn't have some sort of impact on our climate, is a little bit ridiculous. That being said, we have learned a lot from. I talked about how my ancestors, when they first came to Alberta, were helped by the elders and the leadership of those communities. And I think there's a lot more that we can learn, but we have to pay attention to them. Right now, we're having issues with fishing and hunting here in Alberta, and when the elders come to the table to discuss the issues with the biologists, they get basically poo-pooed like they don't know what they're talking about. So I think we do need to recognize the knowledge that's been passed along from generation to generation, and not so much by book and by textbook, but by word of mouth and the learning that's gone along with it. And I think if we can pay more attention to that and respect that learning, I think we'll all be a lot better off. But we do need to work together. It is a huge problem that we're going to be facing, not only this generation, but especially the next generations coming up. And we need to start dealing with it today. Thanks.
So that concludes the prepared questions that we had for the evening. And before we move into closing comments, I wondered if you would entertain a couple of chiefs who might have some questions at this time before we conclude. So with that, I'd like to invite any of the leadership to ask a very quick question. I'll give you 1 minute to ask a question, and each of the candidates will have their 2 minutes to respond. I'll limit it to 3.
Hello, how you guys doing? Chief Drew. Chief Drew. I had a question about how everybody benefits from Treaty 8 oil and Treaty 8, but we don't benefit at all from it. When you go through a recession, I get cheap gas in the pump. My community don't go through a recession. So I want to know when do we get a share of our resources instead of Quebec and the rest of this country profits off our resources and we don't get anything from it. Canadians get it, federal government gets it, Alberta government gets it, but we don't get anything. When are we going to have a chance to get revenue share and have a seat at the table? So
Thank you. We'll start with Mr. Mandel, please.
As I said before, elected Alberta Party group will sit down right away and figure out a deal to work for everybody. We think you've gotten screwed. Let's see if we can find a way to work together to make life better for your community. It's only the benefit of everybody. And I agree with you. Everybody gets a share, but it hasn't been shared all the way around. So we will do that. I promise you that. I've said it many times before. We'll stick to it.
Thank you, Mr. Pian.
You know, the Conservative parties over there have had 44 years to come to the table and they haven't done it. So I can tell you that in the last little while we've been looking at a whole variety of ways of making sure that there are benefits of those resources come into the community. As I mentioned, over $500 million worth of new programs since I became minister, including water and housing and climate leadership and so on. And you know, I am more than prepared to tell you right now that this is an excellent time to be working with our party to get things into the platform that you think are important. We invite you to come, be part of designing these things, and commit this government now to sitting down at the table and having that discussion with you as we move forward into the next 4 years. We are absolutely open to having those discussions with you and look forward to your participation to help us become the government so that we can do that. Thank you.
Mr. Hanson.
Thank you, and thanks for the question, Chief Drew. And you and I have had this conversation a couple of times, I think, already. Again, I'll go back to I was a bit surprised when adjacent Crown land there was no loss of use benefit for your folks up there. But my concern is the deal that the entire north of Alberta gets, and the development. We put up with all the traffic, we put up with the smell from vent tanks, we put up with all that. And the bulk of any revenue that comes out of that, even the royalties, ends up going to the bigger cities, and we don't get the support up in our communities. And I'm talking about education and healthcare, and I understand exactly what you talk about when it comes to the youth in your community and the lack of opportunity there. And I think that's what we have to address, is that if we're going to develop these northern regions, then there has to be some benefit to the people that live there.
And Mr. Khan.
Thank you, Chief. That's a great question, and it's issues like that I've been working on for 8 years in representing First Nations governments across Canada and bringing comprehensive lawsuits for breaches of treaty and breaches of right and land claims for many communities, and it's been a real frustration because there's fundamentally a lack of understanding about what the treaties meant, about what was meant to be shared between the First Nations and settlers, and concepts like the understanding that the treaties meant that you were sharing the land to the depth of the plow and not giving up in perpetuity rights over lands and resources across the country and over all of the lands. So what it really comes down to is we need a fundamental change in our relationship and how we share those resources, and to make sure that First Nations governments are partners in the responsible and safe development of our lands and resources. That's the critical thing that needs to happen, and it doesn't even need to be viewed as a zero-sum game or one small or the pie being redivided. We're increasingly seeing that projects like the Trans Mountain Pipeline, like other oil, gas, and resource development projects are going to be stopped if there isn't a real partnership, an equity partnership, and a true nation-to-nation partnership between First Nations and provincial and federal governments in developing these resources, and a real revenue sharing. If that isn't happening, then these projects aren't going to go forward, and it's going to hurt all of us. So I'm committed to deploying my experience in representing First Nations with the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to come to a new understanding and a new agreement on how we can share.
So I'm going to take 2 more questions, first from Chief Anasay, then from Grand Chief Noski, and remind everybody that this isn't going to be a one-time only thing. There'll be more opportunities to engage with the parties as they travel through our territories, and we'll plan to have one more forum with the leaders of the parties when they have their platforms more developed and have a chance to ask more questions then. So I'll remind you, Chief Anasay, you have 1 minute to ask your question.
Today, we heard a lot from the elders and the youth about the importance of culture, the history, inclusion in the curriculum of Alberta, and also to safeguard the languages and also language development for the youth. Because with all the population in Alberta and Canada, a lot of the First Nations languages are considered to be endangered. And my question is, will the candidates be in full support of these processes that has begun, be continued in development, and be proactive in inclusion for curriculum, language development, and cultural history? Thank you.
We'll start with Mr. Feehan.
Thank you very much, Chief. I really appreciate the question, because I think it's fundamental to the survival of the nation's culture. And we can't not keep the culture alive and expect the people to be there later. And we've done a lot over the last little while. And I keep telling you about the programs that we've done, because it's not just talk from us. We've actually been putting our money and our time and our energy into doing these things already. As you know, for example, we supported some major things like the National Indigenous Cultural Expo or the Elders Gathering that happened. But we've also been supporting powwows across the province, and as you know, many of you know, I attend regularly sweats and pipe ceremonies and stuff to keep that up. But we've also put money into a number of different projects, including the redesign of the curriculum from kindergarten to grade 12 to ensure that the Indigenous history, language, and traditions are kept there. We provided some money this year to a number of different institutions like universities to provide support for instructor development so they can teach the language, and to the Languages and Literacy Development Institute. We put our money where our mouth is, and we have an announcement on Friday coming forward about another piece of project we're doing to ensure that culture and language stays. I can list a lot more, but I run out of time very quickly here. But I can assure you that any of those of you who want to know about all these projects I've been mentioning as we go along, to show where my real steps forward have been, All of that will be available to you. And if you want to get a hold of us, meet my people afterwards, we will make sure that you get copies of the long lists of programs that we have made sure are available to ensure the culture of the Indigenous people in this province.
Thank you. Mr. Khan?
Thank you very much. It's a really wonderful question. We're committed, and I'm committed to ensuring that full control of your educational systems is transferred to your authority, be they regional First Nations or Indigenous school boards, so that you can have collective power over your education systems and have economies of scale within your treaty areas or in smaller groupings of First Nations, so that you, and committed to fighting to ensure that the federal government transfers its powers and authorities to First Nations education systems. We also fully support the revisions to the school curriculum to make sure that there's much more focus on Indigenous and First Nations history in our school system. I grew up in Calgary, and I've learned so much in the last 8 years, and I've been so surprised about how little I knew before I started this journey and being an Indigenous rights lawyer. And it shouldn't take that kind of specialization to learn the history of our province and our country and the history of your people. It should be built in from day one in our education system. So we're committed to those educational revisions. We're committed to providing funding for school immersion programs for First Nations languages, so that you can make sure that your young people have access to instruction in those in your community's languages. I took French immersion in school at no further cost to my parents, and was able to learn a second language and operate in a second language. There should be similar funding for immersion programs for First Nations languages in your community schools across the province.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy?
Thank you. It's been said it's vitally important to maintain culture, language. Without that, you won't have any future. But there's, many people who are here from Treaty 8 that live in their communities have that ability to have that community around them. But we can't forget about the citizens from your communities that have moved into the cities of Edmonton or other places. We need to do a better job in getting them the training and the history of their language and their culture. I think that is something we need to do for more. I know as a former mayor of Edmonton, it was an issue that we struggled with, trying to get education more involved with, in making sure that each of the communities had an opportunity to participate and create language opportunities for people from various parts of the province. So I think it's not just on your lands, your communities. I think you have to reach out into the other communities where so many people are moving to. And I think we need to work together to find a program that allows all of us to learn the great traditions and the history of the communities. But I think it's equally important that we make sure that each of you, as chiefs, work incredibly hard to ensure that citizens of your communities in the cities of Edmonton and around the province of Alberta have the same opportunities as those who do it at your homes. So I think it's something we've forgotten a lot about over the years. But we're going to sustain long-term sustainability of our communities. It really is about not just creating opportunity in the reservation, but within your communities, but also creating opportunities for people within the cities to learn more about their culture and heritage.
Thank you for the great question again. I think the number one thing that we can do, especially I'm very proud to say it's in my area, is to support the Blue Quills University. And I've been trying to get some increased funding for them for about 2 years now. They're having a hard time even putting gravel on their parking lot. But they do have a very extensive Cree and Dene language program that they are teaching anybody that wants to come in and learn it, and trying to promote those languages and make sure that it gets written down and properly educated to the people, so that language doesn't die. And I think that especially the Dene language was on the verge of collapsing a lot of areas. So I think it's very important that we support Blue Quills University, and I'll go on fighting for them for a long time. What we're trying to do out in my area, the town of St. Paul, which is adjacent to Blue Quills and to Saddle Lake, is to get more community involvement. I've actually talked to people out in St. Paul that have lived there for 3 generations and have never been to a Saddle Lake powwow. And it's only 20 miles away. So those are the barriers that we have to kind of break down and make it understood that it's inviting to go out to these communities, both back and forth. The folks from Saddle Lake come into St. Paul all the time, they do their shopping there, but we don't get that reverse flow of people going out to Saddle Lake to make the people learn their culture and see what they're actually all about. And I think if we can concentrate on that, and again, supporting great initiatives like we have out in Blue Quills to keep language and culture alive. Thanks.
So we'll go to our final question for the evening from Grand Chief Noski. You have 1 minute.
1 minute. Thank you. And I guess I like going to the legislature, right? And every time I walk there, I'm reminded by all parties of the floor there that I have constitutional protected rights. So, but on ground zero where I'm at, that's not the same thing. So if elected, what kind of time frame does it take to change the bureaucracy's mindset in what's said at the House actually applies on the ground and comes down to constitutional protected treaty rights?
We'll start with Mr. Mandel.
It's a fascinating question, how to change the bureaucracy overnight. You can figure that out, you're a pretty smart guy. As Grand Chief, you probably are. I think one of the things that's important comes from the top. And I think if the Premier, whoever is appointed the Minister, that's where it starts, it's direction. When I was mayor of the city of Edmonton, we got a tremendous amount done because it started at the top. We gave direction to people and they implemented it. If they didn't, they had heck to pay. I'd use other words, but I won't. So I think it really begins to change when the government in power challenges administration, challenges bureaucracy, and begins to change some of the people. I think, I'm not going to comment on good, bad, or different bureaucracy, but we need to have people there that understand what the government wants to do, and the government gives clear direction of what to do. And I think that's something that's somewhat lacking today of where we need to go as a province in so many different ways. So if we were elected government, we would put in place changes right away, but we would also from the top direct people to make the changes that we said we would implement during the election as we've talked about today.
Well, Chief Noski, I very much share your frustrations with the slow change of government. Sometimes it feels like we've been slamming our head against the wall in trying to come to settlements and agreements for the lawsuits that we've been representing your people for with respect to the provincial and federal governments. So I've lived that experience to a small degree personally, and I'm committed to taking that file on personally and ensuring that there's a laser focus on changing the mindset of government bureaucrats. As I said earlier, there's got to be more leadership at the top, there's got to be more change at the top, and there's got to be a real fundamental buy-in from the top, and then make sure that that's communicated every day and with every decision to the bureaucracy and government employees who aren't bad people. They just lack the training and the education to understand these fundamental issues and to understand that, for example, and unfortunately, this misunderstanding is perpetrated by politicians like Mr. Kenny, who talk about using the notwithstanding clause to override your treaty rights and to act like there's some magic wand that the federal government should be implementing to override your constitutionally protected rights. So I'm committed to being different, to providing that leadership, to speaking out on these issues, and to use my knowledge and experience to help be a force for changing those attitudes and making sure that we all understand that those are that constitutionally protected rights can't be trampled on. Thanks.
Thank you for that question, Chief Hosky. And as I said earlier when I was answering one of the questions, the frustration that I've run into the last 3.5 years during budget debates where we get 3 hours to ask questions of the ministry has always been, and get back and answer and show you that I've asked why there aren't any Indigenous people, First Nations people in senior positions in the ministry. We wouldn't think of doing that in the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Education. So why is Indigenous relations any different? And I think that's where we need to go. We need to, we can't change the bureaucracy, but we can certainly adjust it by having the right people at the table that are advising the ministry. Thanks.
And Mr. Behan.
Thank you very much. I can tell you that my hope coming in my short time as being minister was that I'd be able to make this move a lot faster. And I've learned a lesson. It's not going to happen as fast as I want. But I can tell you we have done many things to begin that process. You know, after many years of not signing the Rubicon land claim, we got it signed because we provided leadership. But many years of not providing water to reserves, we got water to move to reserves because we provided leadership. Many years of the staff and employees of the bureaucracies not understanding what treaty means, we decided to train 27,000 of them over the next few years in doing that. Same in the health services and same in our school systems. We understand that it's about education, it's about moving people along in the bureaucracy, teaching them things that they have not known up till now because this has been a totally neglected area to the Conservatives. And we have moved ahead on all of these things and we're getting some real results on some of these things. They kept telling us, you can't do that. When we wanted to set up a new park in Castle, we now want to set one up in Bighorn. They said, you can't do that. And we said, yeah, we're going to do that. And then they told us, you can't have First Nations run cooperative management in those parks. And we said, yeah, we can do that. And we moved ahead on all of those things. There's been lots of leadership over the last 3 years, but it turns out 3 years isn't enough to change a whole bureaucracy. So what you get from me is my commitment to continue to provide that kind of leadership, to continue to have new ways in which we get the bureaucracy to shift, to continue my work around improving the consultation that I've been working on for the last couple of years, to continue to work on all of the projects that are important to you as a community because I spend time in your communities, you teach me what I need to know, and I go back and I'm starting to teach everyone else. Thank you.
Question and answer portion of our evening. I want to thank you so much for sticking around and being patient, as well to everyone else who's in the audience and who might be watching online. At this time, I'll invite you to get your closing comments ready, and you will have 2 minutes to do so. Once we're done with closing comments, I will invite an elder to come and do a closing prayer, and then we'll have a bit of time to hang out and mingle and chat a little bit if that's what people feel like doing. So without further ado, I would like to invite first Mr. David Kahn of the Alberta Liberal Party to give some closing comments.
Well, again, I want to thank Grand Chief Noski, the treaty organization, and all of you for being here and allowing me to appear personally and answer your questions. I'm happy to stick around for as long as anyone wants to talk with me after. I really want to encourage all of you and any of you that are considering leadership in your own communities to also consider getting involved in provincial politics and having and bringing your voice to the table and getting involved in our party. We're still looking for candidates, especially in Northern Alberta, and I would love to speak with any of you who have that interest, or if you know others that are interested. Alberta Liberals, we're a party that's committed to the values of diversity, reconciliation, and equality of opportunity. And I've been passionate about First Nations and Indigenous issues for 8 years now as a lawyer. And as a government, we will seek to build stronger and better relationships with your governments on a nation-to-nation basis, and focus on getting the results that matter for you. And we've got to work in partnership, as I've said. We're not going to get anywhere, any of us are not going to get anywhere without a much stronger partnership to make sure that things get done in a fair way, and that you have a strong seat at the table. And there's nothing more obvious about that than what's happened with our economy and our resource opportunities in the last few years. And this was something that I'll remind you that Mr. Harper didn't pay attention to in his 14 years in government, and the Conservative parties did not pay attention to this for the 44 years that they controlled the Alberta legislature and government.
Thank you, Mr. Khan.
But I'm passionate and committed to it.
Alberta parties, Mr. Stephen Mandel.
Thank you again. Thank you very much for allowing all of us to be here today and to answer questions and to present our views on different issues. What's become very clear is that there's an awful lot of challenge that exists in the First Nations community, especially today as we talked about Treaty 8. They're not easy problems to be solved as they've been solved many, many years ago. But what can change is if we work together and find a common ground where the chiefs and the communities and the government works together. And we're not telling you we're going to give you money, it's your money we're giving you. I sometimes find it quite surprising when we talk about we're going to give you money for this and give you money for that. Why don't we create an environment where you can have your own money? Through resource sharing, so you can build your communities the way that you think it needs it. The Alberta Party is committed to that. And I really believe that's the change. That's the difference that we can make for everybody's lives. It's about you making the self-determination of what can happen in your world, in your lives. And I think that's what's so beautiful about the opportunity that faces us today. I think there's tremendous pressure on everybody to come together to find solutions to problems. But also there's tremendous pressure to cooperate, to build a better Alberta, to build better communities for yourselves. Because you know something, this is what all of us, and I say that time and time again, what I care most about this province is building a place so my grandson can have a good future. I'm sure everybody in this room wants to build a place for their grandchildren to have a better future. We cannot continue to do the things we've done in the past and do them over and over again, because that's insanity, because you're not going to change. Let's find ways to work together to build a better Alberta for you and for us and for everybody. Not one that is just for some groups of people, not for others. It's about building something for everyone. So again, thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you afterwards and hopefully again,
from the Alberta New Democrats.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming here and spending such an important evening and having this conversation with us. I appreciate many of you traveled from very great distances. I'd like to thank our elders, all of them, but Mike Weaver for starting us with a prayer, and of course all the chiefs for encouraging this kind of conversation, and all the many times they've met with me over the last 3 years to help us move ahead on things. You know, I got to tell you, we have had lots of success over the last 3 years. I've tried to mention many of them, but my list is much longer. And I can tell you I'm also very worried. I'm very worried that many of those successes that we've achieved over the last little while will be put through the shredder this summer if we're not back in. And that concerns me a lot. So let me ask you something. Come and work with us. Come join our party. Become part of our Indigenous caucus. Help us to write the curriculum, because together we have actually built some very important changes on culture, on land, on consultation, on agreements like the Kataskanau Agreement, and all of the other things that we've been doing together over the last years. Climate change is fundamentally important, and we are the party of climate change protection. So We want you at the table. We're putting people at every table we possibly can. We make sure that the First Nations voice is everywhere we can possibly get it. And we want you to help us to be better, to be stronger, and to make sure that we pass on this land to our children. Because this land is your land, and you are its people. Thank you.
Of the United Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for attending tonight and the opportunity. Took a few body blows, but no headshots tonight, so that's really good. I think the biggest difference between myself, at least, and the rest of the folks at the table here is that I actually live and work in northern Alberta. My family's been up there for generations, like I said, and my son and his daughter and my granddaughter have moved back into our area as well, so they'll be around for a long time as well. We're all in this together, I think, especially in northern Alberta, and we have some barricades in front of us, and not small barricades. In 2023, our provincial debt is set to hit $96 billion. We'll be paying $4 billion per year just to service debt. That's $4 billion per year that won't be going into vital services, won't be going into your northern communities, it won't be going into healthcare, won't be going into education. $4 billion a year. That's something that we need to address as a province, not only as northern Alberta, but the entire province. We need to get our debt under control. We need to start paying down our debt and get our economy back on its feet. Without a strong, vital private sector paying the bills, we won't be able to afford all of the great services that our people in our province have taken for granted for a long time. We need to get control over our debt and our spending. As a party, that is as conservatives, that's what we look at, is fiscal responsibility. We need to get our house in order so that we can maintain the good social programs, the education, the healthcare system, and improve on those systems so that we have a strong future for not only Alberta, but especially northern Alberta, and support for our Indigenous communities as well as all of our communities in Alberta. That's something that I'll be working for proudly, and I will be standing up for especially the rights of northern Albertans, and I'll be fighting with my colleagues even from Calgary and Edmonton to make sure that we get the recognition that we deserve in northern Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen. So that wraps up our evening's program. Before we move to hear our closing prayer, I just want to give a round of applause to our candidates, the parties for coming this evening. And give a hand to our young people who've been alternating throughout the evening. And I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to moderate this evening. I feel deeply honored to have been a part of this. Over there with the questions they were asking today. So without further ado, I would like to call upon Elder Danny Rubicam to give us our closing prayer.
Again, I'd like to thank the politicians that are going to run. But one of you people are going to get in. So I just pray that the people make the right decisions for you, the right governments. I don't want to say too much about that, because I was a politician once, a little bit, but not a real politician. So now my job is to close prayer. But that's the best work for a minister. And I realize that everybody here will think it over, what changes they wanted to have for Treaty 8 area. And I just want to close in prayer now. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your wisdom for the people, all people here, the children, and the leadership, and the workers. Lord, bless them as we continue these meetings. Lord, that we make the right decisions, that we, for the people, the young people, the elderly people. We thank you for all that. We ask you to bless these people, their families, and all the people that are listening here. Bless them, and their children, and their grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Bless them. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. And they all said amen. God bless you.